Today on Inside the Issues, we talk to Mark Sedra on Afghanistan. Welcome to Inside the Issues, a podcast of the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. I'm your host, David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Each week, we will be talking with people who are at the forefront of research and analysis in various issues of global governance, including global political economy, environment and energy, development, and global security. Our guest today is Mark Sedra, a CG Senior Fellow and also a Research Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks for having me, David.
Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to talk about Afghanistan, and you are, of course, Canada's foremost expert on the area, so it's a great privilege to have you with us. Let me begin by asking you, first of all, some background questions. Why are we in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, we initially entered Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks on the United States, and we have to remember that 24 Canadians were killed in those attacks. We joined the international community, which almost unanimously condemned these attacks, and this was the initial intervention in Afghanistan was UN mandated by NATO as well, and we were supporting our #1 ally in the United States. This was a legal and just war. And we intervened to remove al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. The 9/11 attacks, all of the attackers, the hijackers, received some training in Afghanistan. The operation itself was partially planned in Afghanistan. This was al-Qaeda's main base of operations. They even had strong links within the Taliban state. So they were well entrenched in this country. So the goal of this operation was to remove al-Qaeda and remove its Taliban backers from power. And Canada joined that mission.
Now, the mission has changed a bit since then. That was 2001. Mm-hmm. How would you characterize the mission now?
Well, I think over time, the different allies engaged in Afghanistan, particularly the United States, came to the conclusion that you couldn't stabilize this country, that you couldn't prevent Afghanistan from once again presenting a threat to the international community, either as becoming a sanctuary for terrorists and militant groups or a source of narcotics for the world market, unless you were able to build a functional state. So initially, when the United States intervened in Afghanistan, and I've spoken to some of the first soldiers and CIA officials and so on who hit the ground, they were told not even to use the language of nation building or state building. They were there for a military operation to remove the Taliban, al-Qaeda, and then to leave. Over time, they realized they have to have a much more ambitious agenda. They have to build a functioning state able to maintain security and able to insulate, the international community from the threats that Afghanistan posed. And so the mission evolved into that state-building process.
But not just any state, right?
Yeah.
A democratic state.
Absolutely.
That respected the rights of individuals and somehow brought together quite a diverse variety of groups, right? Afghanistan's quite divided.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a very diverse country ethnically. It's religiously very diverse, ideologically diverse, a country that's emerged from 3 decades of civil war, partially because of those divisions and that diversity. You can't imagine a more difficult state-building case. I mean, as I said, a country that just emerged from a brutal civil war, one of the poorest countries in the world. The most recent UN Development Index ranked Afghanistan as the second poorest country in the world, and according to its own indicators, the poorest outside of sub-Saharan Africa. It's a country that's in a very bad neighborhood with weak states, rogue states, so to speak, on all of its borders. And it's a country that doesn't have a great deal of a very strong resource base to draw from in order to facilitate stabilization. So it was, from the very beginning, this was about as difficult a case as you can imagine for the international community.
So who was optimistic? Who thought this could actually be done?
Well, it's very interesting you say that because, and even most Afghan and Western officials admit that there was initially a naivete about the situation in Afghanistan, in some ways similar to Iraq, in that in Iraq, of course, the naivete was that all Iraqis would come into the streets and support a Western intervention. Of course, it didn't happen that way. In Afghanistan, the belief was somehow the Afghans' desire for peace, and there was legitimately and still is a strong desire for peace after so many years of war, that somehow that would solve all of the security problems. There was also a naivete concerning the amount of resources that would be required to reconstruct, as I said, one of the poorest countries in the world, a country that never really had a functioning state, where the infrastructure is completely destroyed in most parts of the country, if it ever existed. So to rebuild that sort of state, it's an immense, it takes immense amount of resource. And so there was really, that was severely underestimated. So I think from the very beginning, there were sort of false assumptions and false optimism about what you could accomplish in Afghanistan.
And how much of the problem was the fact that Afghanistan doesn't have a history of being friendly to outsiders, especially well-armed outsiders?
Yeah. Well, we know. I mean, you don't have to spend much time studying the history of Afghanistan to know that the only times that the country has been divided, the diverse array of groups in Afghanistan, is when the country is presented with a foreign invader or foreign occupier, whether it was the British, well, back to Alexander the Great for that matter, to the British, to the Soviets, and now to a certain extent to Western forces in Afghanistan. So I think that this has always been one of those unifying factors and was one of those wild card issues that I don't think the international community considered properly.
Right. Now, you and I have actually spoken before, and I remember being struck when we spoke that you were one of the few people who wasn't obviously pessimistic, this cannot be done, or obviously optimistic, it's just a matter of time. You were always willing to entertain the possibility that this could work. Where are you now? Are you still? Yeah,
well, I mean, I've always said that I am cautiously optimistic. Now I'm a little bit more pessimistic, and I'll tell you why. I find talking to my friends and colleagues in Afghanistan, people who actually were in Afghanistan throughout the entire Civil War period, people who have endured the oppression of the Taliban, now are talking about leaving the country and trying to find their way out. And their belief is that if the Western states, and perhaps there's a degree of naivete there, that the belief that Western states with all their money can accomplish anything. But if they can't solve the problems of Afghanistan, who can? And so maybe it's time to leave. So you see that Afghans who supported wholeheartedly the international intervention have lost faith. And that is a common theme that you hear in Afghan society, that for so long, one of the big strengths of the intervention in Afghanistan is it had the consent of the Afghan people. Well, now many Afghans are either sitting on the fence or are starting to turn against the international engagement. So I think that, to me, that loss of consent is one of the most disturbing things. We've also seen the security situation continue to deteriorate, and we haven't seen the international community really show the necessary resolve to see this mission through. One of the big problems is, and I mean, you know this as well as anybody studying some of the different peace-building missions around the world, that the international community doesn't always have, our democracies don't always have the attention span that's needed to actually succeed in implementing these long-term cases of peace building and state building. And Afghanistan is no different. I think, no matter, even if all the conditions were perfect, this is a generational project to rebuild and to build peace in Afghanistan. So 10 years, we're still at, we're only entering maybe the intermediate stage of this process. And so, but yet we as foreigners expect this to be accomplished already. And that's why you see the Western states wavering in their commitments. And this just is not good for the future of Afghanistan. If countries like Canada, countries like the Netherlands are leaving, this is sending a shockwave throughout the international community, and many are going to follow suit.
Now, you didn't say you're entirely pessimistic, right? You said you're a little bit more pessimistic. So what's the ground of your optimism at this point?
Well, I think, I mean, you can't deny that progress has been made. Despite the fact that there's been some fraud in the elections, elections have been held in Afghanistan, 2 presidential elections and a parliamentary election. One of the most liberal constitutions in the Islamic world has been passed, which provides fundamental protections for the Afghan minorities, for Afghan women, and so on. You've seen the flowering of civil society. It's amazing. I mean, shows like Afghan Idol. I mean, the media is flourishing. The private sector. I mean, when I went into my first trip to Afghanistan in 2003, Kabul was, still there was nothing much there. Now you have shopping malls being built. You can see the private sector booming. It has its first billion-dollar company. So, I mean, there's a lot to point to, not to mention the fact that millions of children are going back to school. including girls. So I could go on and on. There are a lot of positive development indicators to point to. So there is grounds for optimism. And I think that if the international community is to see through their commitment, and there are certain things that have to be done, however, to succeed. Number one, they have to at some stage, and they are already beginning this process, talk to the Taliban, because there is no military solution to this conflict.
All right, well, let's follow up on that in a minute. We'll take a short break and be right back.
Yeah.
You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. You can find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. And I'm back with Mark Sedra. Let's pick up where we left off. You said a little bit about the signs of progress. One of the areas that you focus your own research on is security sector reform. Absolutely. Would you say that there's been progress in that area?
Yeah, there has. We have seen, particularly the Afghan National Army has made significant strides. They are seen by, from all accounts, from many Afghans as a positive symbol of the growth of the Afghan state and of the country. They aren't as affected by corruption as many other institutions in the state, and they've shown themselves to be reasonably effective in combat situations. So that's been a very positive. Their numbers aren't as high as people would like, and certainly they aren't able to undertake full-scale operations without coalition support, but they're making major strides.
So the Afghan National Army is one of
that's right.
So let's talk a bit about them. Now, how representative are they nationally? Are they from all ethnic groups in all regions, roughly equally? This is
an important point, that for the most part, there was very strong efforts made to ensure that it was broadly representative of the range of ethnic groups in Afghanistan. But in reality, still, the majority of the officer corps are Tajiks. And so there is a great deal of disillusionment among some groups that feel underrepresented, particularly in the leadership caste of the Afghan National Army, like the Hazara, the Shia group in Afghanistan, who feel that simply that they don't have an adequate share of the leadership of this new structure, which is going to be so important for stabilizing the Afghan state. So that is a pressing problem that has to be addressed over the long term.
And is that also reflected in governance structures, in the bureaucracy and the positions of high office in various ministries?
Less so now. In the beginning of the reconstruction process, particularly just after the Bonn Agreement in 2001, 2002, you saw that Tajiks took control of the main power ministries in the state. The Tajiks, of course, were the predominant group within the Northern Alliance, which allied with coalition forces to overthrow the Taliban. So they were in a position to assume a great deal of power within the new Afghan state, and they did. Now, over time, you've seen particularly greater representation of Pashtuns within the state, as well as many other ethnic groups. But there still is underrepresentation of some groups, particularly, as I said, the Hazara, the Uzbeks, and a few other smaller ethnic groups still complain of underrepresentation.
Right, and where do the frontline soldiers come from? How are they attracted to the Afghan National Army, and what motivates them? Why do they fight?
Yeah, I mean, many of them are joining to get stable employment. One of the things that the international community, in conjunction with the Afghan government, have done over time is raise salary, create benefits that would make serving in the army very attractive. I mean, so that's one of the main reasons. This is a position, of course, an employment of very high prestige, though, in Afghanistan, to also to fight, to serve in the military. It's so a very martial tradition in Afghanistan. So there is. So I think that's one of the other reasons. But for the most part, many, particularly more so in the police than the army, but still maintain links to their militias in their home communities as well. So that's one of the big issues.
Right. Now the police you mentioned, that's another important actor.
Yeah.
Is there, tell us about the police.
Yeah.
Are they well organized nationally, or are they better organized regionally?
Well, the police is generally a basket case, however you look at it, unfortunately. And I think this was one of the oversights of the reconstruction process, which is not enough investment was made in the police in the early going. I've often said in my own work that there was 2 lost years in the police reform process where there just wasn't enough emphasis placed on creating a functional national police force. Corruption is endemic in the police. There are major problems with leadership. I mean, one of the main reasons for this is the Army. The United States, which took the lead role in creating the Army, they started from scratch. They said, we're building this Army from the ground up. Whereas the police, Germany, who was the initial lead nation, said, we are going to work with existing police forces that exist. Primarily, that personnel were militias who re-had it as police after the Taliban fell. And so, you know, there are so many problems with the police, from ineffectiveness to corruption to their lack of support for national governance structures and really loyalty to local warlords and commanders. So the police needs a lot of work. A lot of investment is going into the police these days, which is a very positive sign, and particularly from the United States. But still, most of the focus is to produce auxiliary soldiers rather than community police able to interact with the Afghan population and improve the security situation, to actually deliver a security service to the Afghan population, which is so important because the police is the main representative of the state at the local level. Right. But most of the training is focused on creating little soldiers. And I think that might help in counterinsurgency operations in the short term, but in the long term, it could be very problematic.
Are the police penetrated by the Taliban at all?
There is a lot of talk of Taliban penetration of the police. In fact, some attacks that have been committed in Kabul and other areas of the country have been perpetrated by those in police uniforms. In some cases, these are people who either were able to fabricate police uniforms or steal police uniforms, but in some cases, they were actually police. And so we also know of a number of cases of police just defecting to the enemy side, to the Taliban side. So infiltration of the police is problematic.
Very, very difficult situation indeed.
Yeah.
We'll be back again in just a moment. You're listening to or watching Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. You can find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. And welcome back, Mark. Let's continue our chat about the Taliban.
Okay.
Obviously a very important actor in Afghanistan. Arguably the reason why we're there is to defeat the Taliban, and essentially to rid Afghanistan of Taliban influence. What is the Taliban?
Well, I mean, the Taliban were students from religious schools. Primarily, they were based in madrasas in Pakistan. And during the inter-Mujahideen civil war, after the Soviets withdrew, there was chaos in Afghanistan. They were mobilized by Mullah Omar and other leaders and entered Afghanistan and were able to march all the way to Kabul and take control of the country. Initially, the Taliban were welcomed by many Afghans because they were providing a degree of stability and security during a very chaotic period where warlords took control of vast areas of the country where there was high levels of criminality and insecurity. So initially, they were welcomed.
Mm-hmm. And they were very largely people who'd been at the forefront of the fight against Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
Some were. The leadership were, but many others were youth who didn't necessarily take part in the jihad, but were, of course, influenced by those who did.
But they're overwhelmingly Pashtun, is that right?
Predominantly Pashtun, although they have some influence in some of the other ethnic groups, but predominantly this is a Pashtun movement.
Mm-hmm. And how would you characterize the connection between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda?
Yeah, well, the Al-Qaeda formed a relationship with the Taliban early on. They actually took part in some of the battles that would lead to the Taliban taking control. And Osama bin Laden and his movement eventually were given sanctuary within Afghanistan once the Taliban took control, and had offices even within parts of the Taliban state. So so there was a very close relationship, and of course one of the reasons why the international community and the coalition intervened in Afghanistan was because the Taliban would not give up Osama bin Laden when they were told to do so after the 9/11 attacks. So there was a close relationship that exists to this day, that the Al-Qaeda still do provide support to the Taliban and to other militant groups within Afghanistan.
Right. Although there are two different stories as to why the Taliban wouldn't give up Osama bin Laden. One is because they were fellow travelers, true believers. The other is that in Afghanistan there are very strong norms of hospitality, and if you actually agreed to host somebody, you cannot.
Absolutely.
So which of those two narratives do you prefer, or are they both
Yeah, I think
fully sufficient to explain what happened?
I think both provide some explanation, but I think more to the case that there was, a genuine affinity between the Taliban movement and Al Qaeda, and some common values and beliefs there that would prompt them to maintain that connection and still to provide some sort of cover for them. But you can't deny some of these cultural motivations as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, some cynics would say that we actually did a very good job in flushing Al Qaeda and the Taliban out of Afghanistan, and we flushed them into Pakistan.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, there are those who say now, I think it's a bit of a stretch, but that Al Qaeda is completely gone from Afghanistan. And it is true that most of Al Qaeda simply picked up and took their shop to Pakistan. And are in the Pakistani tribal areas, most likely the federally administered tribal areas. And we know that the Taliban leadership, Shura, operates openly in Quetta of Pakistani Baluchistan. If you believe the Afghan intelligence service, they have their phone numbers, they know exactly where they are, they attend weddings, they are out in the open and have links with the Pakistani security apparatus. So we know where they went, but Al Qaeda still has operations within Afghanistan, and we know that some of the attacks and some of the militant attacks that have been perpetrated have had the fingerprints of Al Qaeda.
But how do you Taliban-proof or Al Qaeda-proof Afghanistan if they've basically temporarily relocated to Pakistan and in theory can just go to ground and wait until the West loses its nerve? Or
well, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, David. I mean, no counterinsurgency in history has been one where the insurgent actor enjoys an external sanctuary, foreign sanctuary. And the Taliban are fighting the long war. I mean, there's a phrase that the Taliban have adopted from the Mujahideen days where they say, and substituting America there, but they say America has the watches, but the Taliban has the time. Right. So America might have the technology, but this is our homeland, and we are going to fight the long war, and we will prevail. So that's what the Taliban are saying, and that strategy so far has been quite effective.
Right. Well, that seems to have been what happened in Vietnam
Absolutely.
in the 1960s and 70s. And
Absolutely.
what happened also in Afghanistan in
Should be no mystery.
1980s.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's come back in a moment and talk a bit about Canada, specifically
Sure.
in Canada's role. You're listening or watching to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Once again, you can find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Mark, let's talk about Canada and Canada's role in Afghanistan. We aren't the biggest fighting force in Afghanistan, but many people would say we are probably the best. Is that your view?
Well, I mean, I think we've done exceptionally well in the most difficult part of the country, in Kandahar. And we have suffered a disproportionate number of casualties. Over 150 Canadians have died in Afghanistan. And soldiers have died in Afghanistan. And so we've paid a very high price for our contribution to the Afghan rebuilding effort in this war. So I think Canada has done an exceptional job, and this has been recognized by the rest of the international community. And that's precisely why our NATO allies were so worried about the announcement that Canada would be leaving, and why a great deal of pressure was placed on the Canadian government to ensure that they would remain in some capacity.
Right, but arguably we've done our part. Right? We are not the largest NATO country by any stretch.
Absolutely.
As you say, we paid a disproportionate burden.
Yeah.
What's the argument for sticking around longer?
Well, I mean, there are a number of arguments that you could use. Prime Minister Harper has used the argument that, we would be leaving this job half done. That the reality is that the goal is to leave Afghanistan when the Afghan security forces are capable of taking on responsibility for the security situation. And they're not at that stage, and it'll be a number of years before they are. So there is also a major need for trainers and mentors in the Afghan security force training and mentoring process, and so Canada is in a position to contribute to that. I think another reason, of course, is commitment to our allies, that our allies are going to remain in Afghanistan, the United States in particular, and so we have a role as an alliance partner, as a member state in NATO, to continue to contribute where we can. Now, we have done our role as a frontline combat force, and it's time to move on from that, but I think we have the capacity, and we certainly have the experience in Afghanistan to make a major contribution to the training effort.
I know we talked a bit earlier about how Afghanistan is not historically friendly to outside forces. Are we an exception? Do Afghan people look relatively favorably on Canadians, or is it difficult to say?
I'd say that that's often overstated, that we Afghans make a distinction between Canadians and Americans or Canadians and British. I mean, not to say Afghans are very politically savvy, and many would, but for the most part, they identify many of the foreign soldiers as particularly from NATO states as one group. So I think it would be a little much to say that we are viewed differently, although in some cases we will be.
What happens if we fail? What happens if the mission just goes badly or we lose the will?
This is what really concerns me, because when the international community intervened in Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban were close to taking full control of the country. The Northern Alliance didn't really have the capacity to resist the Taliban and to engage in the type of all-out civil war that led to such destruction in the country during the Mujahideen civil war and during the Soviet occupation period. Well, now what essentially has happened is over the past 9 to 10 years, the Northern Alliance have been able to rebuild their military capacity. So if the international community were to withdraw, we wouldn't see the Taliban take power in Kabul right away. We would see another civil war, is my view. And we would see a very brutal civil war where all of the neighboring countries, Pakistan, Iran, India, Russia, China, the Central Asian states would all have a player, and they would all have a stake in this conflict. And so you would see the reemergence of a very destructive proxy war that could kill tens of thousands of people or more, in my view. That is the worst case scenario, which is not outside the realm of possibility.
And would it also be true that the Taliban and al-Qaeda in Pakistan would then move back into Afghanistan largely?
You could see that situation arise where Afghanistan once again, a vacuum is created within the country which will be filled once again by all sorts of transnational terrorist and militant groups, which would set up shop and have a very convenient base with which to launch operations regionally and globally.
Right, but before the American surge, some of the people who argued against it in Washington said, actually, that's a better situation than what we have now, because at least they'd all be in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And at least we could, from a distance with Predator drones and so on, from time to time, keep them off balance and on the run. But we wouldn't have a situation where we have potential terrorists with nuclear weapons actually camped out in a nuclear weapons country, namely Pakistan. So that may sound cynical, but is there any merit to that view that it's actually better if we're out, they're back in, and we can do containment from the outside?
I mean, I actually have to admit I haven't heard that one before. That's very interesting. I mean, I think it's, I could very much picture some people I know in Washington deploying that argument. I think, of course, you don't consider the humanitarian consequences for the Afghan people. We knew al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan prior to 9/11, and it's not like we were able to control them or to disrupt their activities very well, despite the use of cruise missiles and
although it's
CIA
also not like we cared very much.
That's true. That's true. And it's not to say that if some al-Qaeda and Taliban return to Afghanistan that they won't also have a stake in Pakistan. So it's not like they'll leave completely Pakistan. And we've seen, for instance, a new movement emerge in Pakistan, which is a branch of the Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, separate from the Afghan Taliban. So it's not like you would see the de-Talibanization of Pakistan if the Afghan Taliban were to return in Afghanistan. So,
solving one problem creates another.
Exactly.
As so often happens. We'll be back again in just a minute. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. You can find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. We have just a few minutes left. Mark, I'd like to take the opportunity to pass on a question from one of our viewers, Stephen Seidemann in Montreal, who'd like to know that if Canada is going to stick around and continue in a training capacity, are we going to be doing basic training, which anybody could do, or are we going to be doing advanced training of the kind that only Canada can do?
Well, it's not entirely clear yet. The Canadian Force and the Canadian government haven't fully outlined where the Canadian trainers are going to go, although there is some talk that it might be between 600 and 1,000 personnel might be sent in some training capacity. Most likely you will be seeing some providing or supporting some basic training in Kabul, but also you will most likely, because one of the big gaps in Afghanistan is mentors, in-service training, those who actually accompany Afghan troops into the field to provide continuous training. And so I think you'll most likely see some Canadians serve in that mentoring role, which can be dangerous in some respects. So the idea that this is that you're removing all risk by taking on a training role is not entirely accurate.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not.
Yeah.
So if you had to cast your mind well out into the future,
Yeah.
and you do finally see a stable, functioning Afghan state, what date are you looking at?
Yeah, that's that's very hard to say. But as I said before, I mean, this is a generational project, and we have to ask ourselves, what is success? What is a stable, functioning state? Is it something more like Bangladesh? Is it something like Pakistan? So I think regardless of how you look at it, in terms of having security forces that have a reasonable monopoly over the use of coercive force, a government that's able to provide the very basic public goods to the population, I think we're still talking about 5 to 10 years out of international assistance. But still beyond that, you're going to need international support and development aid for some time.
All right, I wonder if any of the current NATO countries has the staying power to see it even that long, 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. I have my doubts about that as well.
Well, I hope you return to a more optimistic view. Thanks very much, Mark, for coming into the studio today.
Yeah.
This has been Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. I hope you'll join us again next week.